Hi, it's Dwyer. It is March 26, 2025. GamblersAdvisory.com, a free site. BettingAngle.us, a free site. Let's talk boxing, but first remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Now, years ago, Robert Helenius was making a lot of waves in the heavyweight division, and he fought Derek Chisora. Now, in my opinion, Derek Chisora beats him in the fight. But my opinion was not the opinion of the judges. Right? The judges, in a very unpopular decision at the time, gave Robert Helenius the nod. Right? So, interestingly, the heavyweight champion, Vitaly Klitschko, used the opportunity to announce that he was going to fight Derek Chisora because he thought Derek Chisora deserved a shot at the title. Let me point out that that's one of the reasons why Vitaly Klitschko is one of the best heavyweights of the last, 30 years or so. Right? So, of course, the heavyweight champion took on Derek Chisora, who actually had one of the better fights against any fighter has had against Vitaly Klitschko. Chisora actually went the distance against Vitaly Klitschko. Now that brings us to the modern time in the heavyweight division. Right? Alexander Usyk is a prize fighter. In other words, the prize matters. At a certain point in a fighter's career, the fighter has a profound choice to make. Right? This point comes after a fighter has already gotten public acclaim, has already accomplished what he wanted to do. Alexander Usyk has been undisputed at cruiser. He's been undisputed at heavy. Understand, there is no question that this fighter who's unbeaten as I make this video is going to be a first ballot Hall of Famer. Folks, he's scaled the top of the mountain, and of course this comes after he won the gold medal at the Olympic Games. So, his sanctioning body, one of them, the WBO, comes to him and they say, look, player, you can't wear our belt if you don't fight our mandatory. And that mandatory has been on quite the run. That mandatory is Joe Parker. Joe Parker has beaten Deontay Wilder, has beaten Zhilei Zhang, has beaten Martin Bakole. Right? Understand, Parker is fighting the people who many don't want to fight. Right? Anthony Joshua has been in the game a long time. He has not fought any of the three guys. Let me repeat that. Any of the three guys who Joe Parker just went out and beat. But understand, Usyk, who already has public acclaim, who already has punched his ticket to the Hall of Fame, is looking at purses, is looking at what people will remember 5 years from now. And he realizes that because Daniel Dubois, a fighter he's already beaten, is on his own streak, having beaten AJ, having beaten before AJ Filip Ergovic, then unbeaten Filip Ergovic. Usyk understands that Dubois has a belt. In the moment, we understand Joe Parker is a ferocious opponent. 5 years from now, as we look at fighters' records, we'll understand that at this moment in time, Daniel Dubois was a reigning heavyweight champ. right? The fight would be a unification fight even if Usyk gets stripped of his WBO title before the fight. Now let me just make some points. They might be controversial here. I need for folks to realize that Joe Parker is the much tougher matchup for Usyk than the Dubois matchup. Right? If Dubois has flashbacks, if Dubois is fighting Usyk, and this frequently happens in rematches, and they revert back to the first fight, and in the first fight, Dubois can't even get by Usyk's jab. Right? I understand there's the, thought that Dubois is going to target Usyk's body. Right? I need for folks to understand that after Usyk gets back off the canvas, granted with a 5-minute rest, Usyk's able to get back in the saddle. In other words, as perplexed as Daniel Dubois was before the knockdown, he's as perplexed after the knockdown. Right? Dubois has had some disturbing fights. The first Joe Joyce fight, the only Joe Joyce fight, where he just can't get the car out of third gear. He's going to have a problem with Usyk's movement. It doesn't quite come across on film, but fighters have a hard time keeping up with Usyk. The best description I've found of Usyk's movement is from one of his victims, Tony Bellew, who talks about the problems he was having keeping Usyk in front of him. Understand too, Bellew at one point during that fight, and that's a very important fight to look at, because it shows the Usyk pattern of starting slow. Right? At one point, Bellew, during the fight, looks at Usyk, waves his hands, and demands that Usyk come find him, come fight him. Right? Because Usyk's moving around. Now, to the fan, it's more subtle than an Ali up on his toes, dancing around you. But in the ring, it's as effective. Let me point out, too, that one of the secrets to Roy Jones were the feints. Right? The feints always kept you leaning backwards, uncertain about what to do. Right? Jones, of course, had a punch. Jones, of course, freak athlete, major hand speed. The feints allowed Jones to keep you outside without spending the energy necessary to constantly throw a jab. Usyk's a master feinter. You couple that with Usyk's movement and Usyk's jab, and it's the jab that's Usyk's best punch in the first fight against Dubois. And you have a situation where Usyk would have a decided advantage in a rematch against Daniel Dubois. Right? Dubois can't box with Usyk. He would need knockdowns, a stoppage. By contrast, Joe Parker can move. Parker, in his 30s, in my opinion, is one of the best athletes in the heavyweight division. More importantly, Parker has ring coverage. You saw that, by the way, at the end of the Bacoli fight. Parker is not close to Bacoli when he throws the right hand that ends that fight. Right? Parker throws it. Bacoli then does a little dance. Parker's not even in the frame, folks. He's that far away when he throws the punch. If Usyk moves on Parker, Parker's going to move with him. There also is the lack of familiarity. Right? Usyk fought several rounds with Daniel Dubois. Several. He knows Dubois. He doesn't know Parker. Right? Now, we the fans aren't being asked what fight we want to see next. It's a little bit shocking that Parker was scheduled to fight Dubois, who I understand paid a lot of money in camp, right? And only to hear that Dubois had a respiratory ailment that prevented him from going forward with that fight. Now, I'm a skeptic. Let's just say suddenly we started hearing about the Dubois-Usyk rematch, right? We, the fans, should be demanding that Usyk fight Joe Parker. Let me make a point here. You know, history, what happened in the past, how we perceive it more accurately, changes based on what happens in the present. Joe Parker was an unbeaten heavyweight champion when he lost to Anthony Joshua. I encourage people to go back and look at that fight. First, the fight's in Joshua's backyard. Right? Second, Joshua was immensely popular because he was an Olympic champion and he was unbeaten at the time. Understand, the Olympics that Joshua won took place in Joshua's backyard, London. Right now, the referee and fights, unfortunately, sometimes turn on this. The referee would not allow Joe Parker to fight inside. Parker's personality isn't the type of personality where after a fight like that, he then screams bloody murder, goes to the press, makes his case, talks about how he was robbed. That's not who he is. Right? But if you're a boxing hardcore person, you saw that fight and you were disappointed because you wanted to see how Anthony Joshua would handle a Joseph Parker deep in the pocket fighting low. Right? Understand, Parker was able to get deep in the pocket and fight low against both Zhilei Zhang and Deontay Wilder. Well, history would change if Parker, a former champion, becomes a two-time heavyweight champion by giving Alexander Usyk his first loss. I'm not saying Parker should be favored in a fight against Alexander Usyk. What I am saying, though, is that fight's likely to be mispriced. And Parker, who has at least a 40% chance of winning that fight, in my eyes, would be the betting side of the play. To sum up, Usyk has a choice to make. He can take the money and the legacy that comes from fighting a reigning champion by rematching Daniel Dubois. Right? Understand, Usyk has made a living beating guys with big punches who can't box with him. Right? He can do that, or he can take on the tougher opponent to prove to us that he's the baddest heavyweight on the planet. Right? I can't blame him for going for the money. I can't blame him for taking the easier fight by fighting Dubois. But let's hope he is one of these fighters who, like Vitaly Klitschko years ago, understands who the tougher opponent is. Understand who the more deserving opponent is. And takes that challenge by fighting Joe Parker. Let's talk about some angles in boxing that people need to think about. I'm hearing Hamzah Sheeraz walks around at 200 pounds. Folks, he's been fighting at 160 pounds. I'm hearing this is a yo-yo weight situation, right? Pay close attention to Hamzah Sheeraz. I don't know who wins a fight between him and Janabek. Right? Janabek, southpaw, Sheeraz, southpaw, who fights orthodox. Sheeraz has a jab that's a problem. It's one of the best jabs in boxing. But it sounds like Sheeraz also has a weight problem that may have developed into a stamina problem. I thought Sheeraz beat Carlos Adames. I know that places me in the minority, so it goes. But I was shocked myself at how strong Adames finished that fight. Now let me say this, and I don't say it lightly. Right? 168 has more openings for Sheeraz, who I think has a better shot against Canelo than does Terence Crawford. Right? 168 has an opening. If I'm Sheeraz, the real threat at 168 for me would be Diego Pacheco. Right? That's the real threat. The problem Sheeraz faces is 175 is too rough and tumble. Right? In his own country. 175 in his own country has Callum Smith, who's still alive and kicking. It has Joshua Buatsi. It has Anthony Yarde, all three guys with punches. Yarde, of course, is about to fight Lyndon Arthur. Arthur has a jab that's close, not quite there, but it's close to Sheeraz's jab. Sheeraz at 175, in my opinion, would have the same problem, and this is the problem, that Terence Crawford's going to have at 168. Right? It's not that Sheeraz doesn't walk around weighing a lot, like Crawford apparently is doing right now. Apparently, according to reports, Crawford's walking around weighing 180. Right? It's not that Sheeraz doesn't have the weight on him. The question is whether Sheeraz is accustomed to getting hit by punchers at 175. World-class punchers at 175. You might not get this in sparring. Does Sheeraz have the chin to get hit by an Anthony Yarde at 175 pounds? Right, folks? Those are the questions we need to ask. Right? I believe he beats Canelo because he doesn't get hit by Canelo. This is the tall guy who knows how to use his height, who can move. He's moving in the forgotten rounds against Adames. Right? The first 5 rounds, he's moving. Right? The same way he goes the distance against Adames, who is more aggressive than Canelo. I believe he'd be able to make it through the first 5 rounds against Saul Alvarez. He'd bank those rounds. I think Canelo would have to start to get desperate. There's a length dynamic in trying to hit Hamzah Sheeraz at 168. The problem is Canelo's an outlier, right? 5'8" at 168 isn't close to the height that Diego Pacheco, a slugger who's tall, has at 168. Right? The question would be whether Pacheco, who's tall, has the dexterity to avoid Sheeraz's jab. At 175, you have a problem. Right? You have guys who might come in and say, forget jabs. I'll take this middleweight's jab to land my hooks. Isn't that what Callum Smith would do? Smith also has a dynamic where he can lean when he throws punches, right? Smith's not upright trying to hit you with shots. He's throwing low hooks. Guys would go body hunting on Hamzah Sheeraz at 175, right? I think over time we're going to get the answers to these questions, right? The truth is there's also an age dynamic at 175. How old is Beterbiev? How old is Bivol? How old is Yard? How old is Smith? Which one of those fighters is under 30? Are any? Right? With regard to Crawford, I understand he has the world-class trainer, Bomac. He himself has had a very successful career. What that means is, like Dubois, he can spend a lot of money on camps. Right? The problem is he's fighting Canelo in Vegas. Right? That's the problem. He's fighting Canelo in Vegas. Now that has a big assumption attached. The assumption is that Canelo gets by William Skull. Right? Understand, Skull is the better athlete than Canelo. So if Crawford fights Canelo in Vegas and Canelo has the belt, and Canelo has a punch that has already stopped a champion at 175 in Kovalev, right? Can Crawford, who skips 160, who skips the meat and potatoes of 154. His fight at 154 was against Madrimov, who since lost to Virgil Ortiz. Right? Crawford doesn't stick around 154 to fight Ortiz, to fight some of the other guys at 154. I think Erickson Lubin would be a tough fight for Crawford at 154. Right? Now, I don't blame Crawford for fighting Canelo. Right? Quite frankly, this is the move I would make if I were Crawford. You're on the way out the door, just like Ray Robinson was years ago, and you have an itch you need to scratch. Ray Robinson needed to see if he could beat the champion at 175. Right? He wasn't going to fight everybody at 175. He needed to see if he could beat Hall of Famer Joey Maxim. Here, Crawford, on his way out the door, he knows Murtazayev would be tough for him. Crawford knows that at 160, it'd be damn near impossible for him. Right? Janabek would come looking for him. Janabek hits harder than Crawford, who's a closer. Let's remember, Crawford was a closer at 147. At 154, Madrimov goes the distance. In fairness to Crawford, Madrimov goes the distance against Ortiz, who is one of boxing's premier closers himself. Right? Just understand, Janabek would come looking for Crawford and would try to stop him. Crawford might not have the length to compete with Hamzah Sheeraz. We're here talking about Carlos Adames, how he kept bringing the heat on Sheeraz in his last fight. Adames would be in the pocket on Crawford. Understand, Crawford's ability to be successful at 160 wouldn't hinge on Crawford's punch. It would hinge on Crawford's legs and his movement. Folks, he's not going to be in the pocket at 168. against Canelo, a guy who has been the champion at 175 in the past. Right? Crawford's success against Canelo is going to come down to Crawford's ability not to get hit. It's going to come down to Crawford's ability to move. Are you confident in that ability? 14 pounds above where Crawford last fought. I'm just telling you, some guys gain weight and they slow down. Right? If you're going to win a fight based on your agility, right? Based on your elusiveness, based on your back foot, right? Gaining weight might not be the way to do it, especially when you haven't fought in the division or the division below it in a professional fight before. Let me close by saying this. You have a guy who, in my opinion, is a Hall of Famer if people look closely at him. His only loss is to Dimitri Bivol, who himself is a future Hall of Famer. I know it sounds like I'm saying everyone gets in the Hall of Fame, right? This video, I'm putting Canelo in the Hall of Fame. I believe Crawford's a Hall of Famer. I believe Usyk's a Hall of Famer. Folks, this is the upper crust of the sport. And one of the upper crust guys is Gilberto Ramirez at cruiser. But we're hearing Ramirez walks around at 208. In other words, understand, weight classes exist for a reason. Weigh-ins are the ultimate illusion. Right? A guy who walks around at 208 is able to make 200 for 5 minutes at a weigh-in. He's able to compete at 200. Right now, the reason why Gilberto Ramirez's weight matters at 200 is because one of the stars of that division, Jay Opataya, is one of the best athletes in the sport. Right, folks? He's blessed with great legs. Opataya is the cruiserweight's version of Alexander Usyk. Good luck keeping him in front of you. Right? The question is Ramirez going to stick around 200 long enough to fight Jay Opataya? Right? The answer to that question might be no, out of necessity. Because if Ramirez understands that he can't really make weight, he's already been a unified champ at 200, then he might be better served going up to Bridger weight to fight Kevin Lorena. And understand the weight limit at Bridger weight is in the 220s. Let me say this too. And it's interesting how the sport plays out. Jake Paul wanted to fight Canelo. Now let's really think this through. Jake Paul just fought heavyweight Mike Tyson. And for that fight, Jake Paul weighed in the 220s. Right now, I'll give MVP credit. Folks, we all need to take this group seriously. Understand, Jake Paul, who used to fight at cruiser, has not been calling out cruiserweights. He's not calling out Jay Opataya because Jake Paul now has developed his back foot. His plan to beat Mike Tyson was to move away from Mike Tyson. And he did so. Right? Understand, he's not calling out Jay Opataya because he can't move away from Jay Opataya. Jay Opataya is a problem whether you're in the pocket or out of the pocket. So he calls out a champ at 168 who, I believe, Crawford plans to try to beat on his back foot. The fight to look at in Crawford's past that I believe will be Crawford's strategy for Canelo is the Victor Postal fight. Right? So understand, Jake Paul doesn't want to fight Jay Opetaia. Jake Paul understands that he can't fight Gilberto Ramirez. Ramirez is too good a fighter. Right? As I said here before, Ramirez is a future Hall of Famer. So Jake Paul and MVP have looked at the cash cow fighters, and they're picking on two. Right? This is a story that needs to be more front page. Right? These are two cash cow fighters. One is Canelo. Canelo's smaller than Jake Paul. Canelo can't move as well as Jake Paul. Understand, Jake Paul hits harder than Jermell Charlo. Right? If Canelo tries to run in a straight line over to him, Jake Paul's going to have firepower for Canelo. Right? Weight divisions exist in boxing for a reason. That would be a heavyweight fighting a super middle. The other person Jake Paul has started calling out, and it's not yet on the front page, is the cash cow of the heavyweight division, Anthony Joshua. Right? Understand, Jake Paul's not calling out Usyk because Usyk would be able to move with him. Right? No, he has picked a heavyweight who's a little bigger and clunkier, who Jake Paul feels he might be able to outmaneuver. Right? Understand the added wrinkle. Jake Paul fights Tyson in the 220s. The champ at Bridgerweight, Kevin Lerena, who knocked down Dubois multiple times. He has a punch, even though his career KO percentage is sub 50. Right? Lerena is willing to fight Jake Paul. Jake Paul understands Lerena would be a tough matchup. Lerena also isn't the household name. Canelo is, or Joshua. So now we have Jake Paul targeting Anthony Joshua. Just realize that Jake Paul is smart enough not to accept the challenge of Kevin Lerena and not to even discuss Gilberto Ramirez or Jay Opetaia. That's the world we live in. In sum, I don't begrudge any fighter who has earned his stripes, who decides, you know what, I'm going to take the easier fight by fighting a reigning heavyweight champion who I've beaten before for a bigger payday than I would get fighting the bigger challenge, the guy on the run through three of the biggest punchers in the division. Right? But I need for folks to understand what Joe Louis said. You can run, but you can't hide. If Usyk avoids Parker, given that a vulnerability Usyk has might be his body, we, the boxing public, can't let him avoid the premier body puncher in the heavyweight division, and that's Ajit Kabayel, who, by the way, can move with Usyk. Right? If Usyk wants to challenge himself, his next two fights need to be Joe Parker and Ajit Kabayel. Right? The Parker fight would have him satisfy his mandatory challenger requirement for his WBO title. So whatever happens to the other titles, he would satisfy the WBO's requirement by fighting the mandatory Then he'd have a voluntary for that title. And understand, Ajit Kabayel, as I make this video, is unbeaten. Right? If he wants the easier money, he can fight Dubois. He can, fight one of the other contenders in the heavyweight division. The heavyweight division now has a lot of guys who are getting a lot of buzz, right? Moses Atam is one of them, right? Who would be blockbuster fights, but who may not be the biggest problems for Usyk individually in Parker and Kabayel. Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours in the comment section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.